Welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
So there you go. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. I want to thank you for tuning in, whether you're listening to this as a podcast or whether you're catching us live streaming on Facebook Live. Look, I saw the film Sugarcane the other day. It's on Hulu and I guess about a couple of other streaming services, I guess. And it's about a residential school on the Canadian side, not far from Kamloops, where they had discovered as many as or in excess of 200 potential buried children near a residential school there. And I want to talk about this. One of the things that comes to mind as you hear the horror stories over and over again on both the U.S. and the Canadian side is that it cannot possibly be a coincidence that this kind of behavior and this kind of abuse could just happen by happenstance. You know what I'm saying? It can't be that you just create an environment where this just happens all by itself. Now, granted, the environment does make a big difference. I mean, you talk about an abused people, children who have obviously suffered with poverty and any number of life conditions created by the U.S. and the Canadian government. Make no mistake about that, including the poor quality of life associated with alcoholism and substance abuse and other things that were happening for generations. I have to remind people, requisitioning liquor was a part of the supplies that were brought in to negotiate treaties. So just so you know, I mean, introducing alcohol to Native people is again, it's not just a coincidence. It didn't just happen by chance. It was intentional. The intention was to so severely handicap Native people and get them under the influence. So when they were negotiating these so-called treaties, that they were easily coerced or simply didn't know what they were doing. And of course, you had language barriers, you had all kinds of other things, but alcohol just added to it all. And the poor quality of life that became on Native territories, the more alcohol seemed to be relatively available. I mean, even when food was scarce, alcohol wasn't. So the conditions that were created on Native territories throughout the entire era of boarding schools, they are bookended by massacres, intentional spread of disease, forced relocation, being confined to quote unquote reservations, literally in prison. These are like prison camps. See, we don't always think about these things now because now we look at our territories that we call reservations as the lands that we occupy and that they're ours, and we have some illusions about how much sovereignty the federal government recognizes on that land versus how much sovereignty we maintain is on that land. So we don't look at what the reservation system was as it was defined. Look, most of these times they had a military fort right nearby. So the conditions by which children were forced to live was pretty devastating. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. So when they do these schools, oftentimes they're pitching it as if they're saving our children. They're saving our children from the poverty. They're saving our children from the abuse at home. And of course, all of those conditions at home were created by the same government that's now funding these residential schools. These residential schools existed for over 150 years. I mean, the first budget item in the United States was called the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. That's when it was passed, and that was right then. That was appropriating money to indoctrinate Native children into not just into Christianity, but into civilized life. And it started as a relatively small program. Of course, you've got to consider inflation and what those dollars really were, but a lot of it was funding existing church mission schools. And of course, that whole policy would grow to building these schools, creating these schools throughout the U.S. and Canada. Over 400. I mean, and I've heard numbers that were something like 417, 420 of these federally funded schools on the U.S. side, including 7 in Hawaii, I think a dozen in Alaska. And of course, this doesn't count the state funded schools or the ones that were still solely funded through churches. So you can put this number up to over 500 easily. I mean, I live here in the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, where the Thomas Indian School existed, and that's not considered a federally funded boarding school, but it met all of the other horrific criteria to match up with those. On the Canadian side, they're saying that it was somewhere around 140 of these schools, and it was likely higher than that. Because again, you have some of these schools are not funded by the Canadian government. They have other means of funding, and, particularly through the churches and that kind of stuff. And I want to be clear, not all of these mission schools, not all of these boarding schools, rather, were run by churches. The majority of them were, but not all of them were. So I come back to the question, how do you have, almost without exception, abuse happening at every one of these schools? At every one of them. I mean, and it didn't matter the size of the school. It didn't matter the location, whether it was, out west or on the East Coast. I mean, Carlisle Indian School was rife with abuse. It didn't matter, again, if it was on the Canadian side or the U.S. side. It didn't matter if it was remote or if it was close by to, a non-native population. It didn't. I mean, Carlisle's right there in Pennsylvania. It's not far from the rest of civilization. But none of that mattered. The abuse took place over and over again, and the cover-ups are almost identical in every one of these. Whether it involved church officials, clerics, or whether it was just these hired headmasters, by the Interior Department or whomever. So when I say this, it begs the question. Yes, we know the schools themselves were a system. We know that it was a strategy, and we know the curricula and actually the curricula wasn't really regulated. What happened in those schools was totally up to the people running the schools. They really had unfettered access, not only to the children, but even to their dollars, because they actually had power of attorney. So if there was accounts, if there was funding available. And the crazy part is some of these schools, let me back up. Deb Haaland, when she spent her last 2 or 3 years investigating residential schools, one of the things she did was tallied up how much federal funding went into the residential schools on the U.S. side. This is just the U.S. side. And then adjusted it for inflation up to last year's inflation rate, which I don't know why she could have done this year's. It's just a plugging in a number. And what they determined was that the United States spent $23.3 billion in funding, in paying for this atrocity, this genocide, because that's what these schools were. I mean, she goes through and calculates how much it costs to perpetrate the crime, and just their costs. Because look, Native people were funding some of these schools. They were funding some of these schools through some of our own resources that the United States was controlling, and I suspect on the Canadian side as well. So not only are we funding the schools partially, whether it was against our will or not. And look, here's the other thing. You do this thing for generation after generation after generation. And when you start them and it seems like, hey, these might be a good thing. We're going to educate Native children. But by the time the abuse starts to, trickle out into the knowledge of that abuse trickles out to people, you've already got a bunch of kids that have gone through the system. So now you have Native people who are complicit with these things. And to some level, there was always a certain level of complicity. I mean, I was just reading a story that said that there were people from Puerto Rico who paid to send their kids, wealthy people from Puerto Rico paid to send their kids to Carlisle Indian School because they thought it was a great place for their kids to get an education. Then once they realized that with the abuse there, they yanked the kids out. I mean, it becomes a bit of a debate on, okay, well, what does it mean if again, Puerto Rican children, we get into this whole debate of who's indigenous and who's not indigenous, which I'm not even going to tackle that right here. That's a whole nother discussion, and I will address that at some point. But so these schools, like the one here on the Cattaraugus territory, the Thomas Indian School. I mean, it when it was first started, yes, it was started by church people, which is already means there's going to be a certain level of indoctrination. But it was church people who lived in the community for a number of years. In fact, they lived at Buffalo Creek before they were moved out here to Cattaraugus. And they knew that between typhoid fever, the poverty, the alcohol, and everything else, that there were a lot of orphaned Seneca children. So when Thomas Indian School starts, it starts out as an orphanage for not just destitute kids, but kids who were parentless, oftentimes homeless. So it sounds like it's a great charitable, philanthropic endeavor. But the abuse becomes. And then, of course, the more the state got involved in terms of funding it, not only as a school originally, and then as a charity associated with mental illness and that kind of stuff, because that's what New York State did. They characterized Native children as handicapped, that we were irredeemable because of who we were, that being Native automatically meant that you were mentally deficient. I mean, I know it sounds silly or absurd, but that's the way New York State dealt with the Thomas Indian schools and a couple of others. But so these things start with great intentions and they go foul real quick. So the question that I am left with is the abuse systemic? Look, we know the harshness and the strict policies of indoctrination, both, especially from a Christianity standpoint, but the strictness associated with forbidding children to speak their language or to maintain any level of Native identity. I mean, that was the purpose, right? I mean, kill the Indian, save the man. That was the strategy. And I got to say it, anytime I say that, I'm going to always follow it up with this. For anyone who says kill the Indian, save the man, that it was just a metaphor. They weren't literally talking about killing children. It meant kill an element of their character. No. Metaphors don't need graveyards. Metaphors don't need mass graves or unmarked graves. Dead children need graves. That's who needs graves. So anytime I hear somebody say, well, kill the Indian, save the man didn't mean literally to kill them, then why were the deaths? I mean, I know many of you listening to this program, Native or non-Native, went to school, and I guarantee your school did not have a graveyard associated with the student body. I guarantee nobody listening to this podcast, to this live stream, attended a school where the school needed a graveyard. I guarantee it. And if you did, I'd love to hear it, because that school needs to be investigated, as do all these. So the question again comes back. We get fed this. Well, there's always going to be bad apples. I mean, that's what they said about the clergy sex abuse scandals in the churches in Boston and different places here in Buffalo. I mean, that you're going to have some bad apples. This isn't bad apples. This is every single school this abuse took place in. Every school. Now, I suspect that some of them were worse than others. There were probably more deaths associated with some schools than others. But I need to remind people about Carlisle Indian School, because Carlisle was the flagship, right? I mean, this was the one where they turned these kids into athletes and, put them on display playing football against older, Ivy League schools. And, Jim Thorpe goes out and wins the Olympics and the pentathlon and the decathlon. So this is the flagship, right? Carlisle Indian School only existed for 40 years. 10,000 kids went through there. The graveyard had gravestones, marked graves, for over 200. only 150 kids graduated. Now, and let me again remind people, Carlisle Indian School was only for kids that were 15 to 18 or 19 years old. So this wasn't little kids. These weren't little kids who might be more vulnerable to illness or accidents and that kind of stuff. No, these are already kids that are somewhat physically developed in their teens. These are the healthiest demographics of of any society, 15 to 19. And yet they buried more kids there than they graduated in 40 years. 10,000 kids, only 158 graduates. Jim Thorpe never graduated from there. No, he didn't graduate. He was exploited, as were many of the other kids that were there for their athletic prowess, so they could put them on display. Say, "Oh, see what happens when you give rigid, strict, control over these kids. See what happens when you educate them right. You can turn them into a fine football team." And those kids were exploited for it. And it didn't matter how much of an athletic star they were; they still didn't graduate. And when they say that there were grave sites, marked graves for over 200, that doesn't count the potential for unmarked graves or the hundreds and hundreds of children that were sent home deathly ill from Carlisle Indian School. Preston McBride, grad student from Dartmouth, who went on to, I think, UC Berkeley, did a whole study on this. And he determined that Carlisle Indian School alone may have been responsible for as many as 700 deaths. Either the kids that died there, died on their way home, or died as soon as they got home because they were so deathly ill or so abused. Because there's 100 ways to die, right? I mean, you can get sick and die. You can die of an accident. You can die of poor health care. Even a minor injury could turn into a catastrophic injury if it's not treated properly. And of course, there was never proper attention given to quarantining, whether it was Spanish, fever or the Spanish flu, or whether it was typhoid or any of these other things that made their way through native peoples. Because at some point, the mortality rate at some of these schools on both the U.S. and Canadian side was in excess of 50%. I mean, half of the kids in those schools would die. Now, I'm not saying that was always the mortality rate, but it certainly was a mortality rate at some points. So, yes, you have conditions where children are living in extreme conditions, both because of they're being forced to work. They're actually working as child slaves. They're being sent out to work for farmers in the summer times, and they're putting the girls are being forced to be housemaids, and the boys are being forced to be migrant workers, essentially, or hard labor, unskilled labor. That's what was happening to these kids. Wasn't a whole lot of education. No doctors and lawyers coming out of this group. Now, I know that they might prop up a kid, here or there to say, "Oh, look at this one. We sent him to college." Now, these kids weren't going to college. They weren't even graduating from the schools that they were in. They would age out, but that's not the same thing as graduating. So I know it's absurd to suggest that there was a written policy that said, "Please do abuse these children." But there has to be something more to it than just a coincidence that every one of these schools could be this abusive. That this level of abuse and the deaths and the illnesses, the injuries, the trauma, the punishments, the suicides. Look, for many years in the United States, they never even tracked youth suicides because it was such an anomaly. Look, a child committing suicide, that's unheard of. You know where it was never unheard of? Native populations. Because the suicide rate of children at these schools would have been a percentage that was not just measurable, but meaningful had they been tracked. But they weren't. They weren't tracked. Until little white kids and some of these these copycat things, these almost cultish kind of things, and of course mix in some drugs, till white kids start committing suicide, till depression becomes so epidemic within the American society, where kids are committing suicide. They didn't even track it. Never even tracked it because suicide for children was considered an anomaly unless you looked at Native kids. But you know what? We created that category was almost created by us solely at one point. And today we still lead as a percentage of our population. We lead in that category hands down. We have the lowest mortality or life expectancy rate. I think I said it half in jest. I'm gonna turn 65 this week. The life expectancy for a Native person is 65. For a Native male, it's 61. I'm already living on borrowed time as far as that goes. This is anywhere from 10 to 14 years lower than the rest of American society. And Americans don't have great life expectancy rates either. So I'm not saying, I mean, look, in countries in Europe, the life expectancy is in the 80s. In the United States, it's only in the 70s. So, I mean, the conditions that we live in, for a variety of reasons, makes life challenging. But when you consider the deaths and the injuries that took place at these schools, so again, 100 ways to die. Yes, you could get sick and die. You could die of an accident. You could suicide, murder, physical abuse that leads to death. So I'm not talking about cutting yourself and getting infected and dying. I'm talking about being physically abused and that physical abuse leading to death. But there's also well documented. It's well documented how many kids died trying to leave these schools. Froze to death, died of exposure, drowned, killed on the roads. I mean, look, we've had missing and murdered Indigenous women and children for many years. I mean, look, it was government policy to make our kids missing. But if you find a couple of Native kids wandering off by themselves, that's almost a license to do whatever you want to them. So not only were they abused at school, they were abused on the way home, trying to get home. And many times these kids didn't even know how to get home. They were shipped hundreds of miles away, sometimes in excess of over 1,000 miles away from their home, so they could be disassociated with their culture, with their families, with their people, with their nation. That was the intent. Kill the Indian, save the man. I mean, I question whether the man they're trying to save was them or us. I don't think they were trying to save us. I say it all the time. If you read the definition, the international definition of genocide, the main issue with genocide, I mean, to constitute genocide, has to be intent. Do you do these five, and there's 5 things that they list. Are these 5 things being done to a people with the intent to destroy them? Killing a population, killing people. Physically, psychologically, sexually, which is physical, abusing a people. Creating conditions that would destroy a people. And when I say creating conditions, well, if you strip away their culture, their language, and all those things, so even if you make it through that whole process, you are not the people you were when you got there. So that's the third one, creating conditions. So you've got, again, death, injury, creating the conditions that would destroy a people. Then the other 2 are sterilization, the idea of inhibiting births, the reproductive ability of the people in these schools, the women in particular, and that was done in these schools. And then, of course, taking children from one population and putting them in the other. But that's not just taking the children and putting them in the residential schools. It's where those kids go after that residential schools. Because those schools became part of what would be the foster care and the adoption system too. Because they were just as abusive. So, I mean, I talk about this all the time. In Maine, when they did their Truth and Reconciliation Commission on, it was on foster care. It wasn't on residential schools. It was on the number of children who were ripped from their homes, sent off to be raised by white people, and not to be raised by affluent white people so they could, enjoy the fruits of white affluence. No, to be abused by those people who had them, who took them. Not just adopted them, but had them in foster care. They became their servants, their slaves, sex slaves, oftentimes too. So, I mean, when I talk about residential schools being genocide, it's the definition of genocide. When you look at what the definition of genocide is, it's almost like, how could they have created those 5 criterion and not have done it specifically to address residential schools? Because it wasn't done that way. The definition of genocide wasn't developed because of what was being done to us. It had to do with stuff that was happening in Europe. Because this kind of abuse, this kind of ethnic cleansing was being done to other people as well. So that's what this definition came from. I mean, and it was essentially a descendant of what they called denationalization, the stripping away of national character and the imposition of another nation's character upon a people. But see, they elaborated because they had to say, well, it's not just about stripping away. It's about killing people. It's about abusing people. It's not like just going through some assimilation program. I mean, in the United States, they treat the word assimilation like it's a good thing. Well, if you're an immigrant and you come to this country, we're going to give you all the necessary tools so you can assimilate to American society. Like that's a good thing. And you look, for many people, maybe they do think that's the case. But when you beat a child for speaking their language, when you strip away anything that connects them to their family, to their people, to their culture, forbid it, and actually torture children who try to do it, that's not giving somebody a better life. And these things existed for 150 years. Everybody talks about 7 generations. These things existed longer than 7 generations. And at some point, the parents of the kids in these residential schools had gone to residential schools, and their grandparents had gone to residential schools. So we're talking about 3, 4, 5 generations of kids. If you were lucky enough to survive a residential school, you would leave that without any of the skill sets that would have been handed down from your parents and your grandparents. So you wouldn't even know how to be a parent. So having your kids ripped away and sent off to a residential school seemed like a normal thing, in spite of the abuse. You get taught that the abuse is really good for you because it's going to give you, all of that rigid upbringing that you need. It's going to give you the structure. And what I come back to, and again, watching this film, Sugarcane, and again, I encourage you to watch it. But if you watch this film and it makes you cry, which it may, I hope it makes you angry too. I hope it makes you angry. I hope it pisses you off to no end. I mean, the crazy part is these kids who are abused at the hands of, in this case, the Catholic Church, remained Catholic. They still believed in this religion, even though this religion was doing this stuff. And the God that they were praying to wasn't giving them any relief. The crazy part, can you imagine being raped by a priest? And you have to be told, and you're being convinced that you're being raped essentially because of something wrong with you. And then you're supposed to go into a confession booth with that same priest? What do you confess? I mean, how do you sit in that dark booth asking for forgiveness from the guy who raped you? I mean, the absurdity is just beyond me. One of the things that I learned, and I don't know why I never thought of this before, but one of the things that they had done in investigating, I think it was called St. Joseph's Mission School or something like that. One of the things that they did was they used some of the DNA stuff. I don't know if it's Ancestry.com or 23andMe or whatever else. And they did, this one guy who was a former chief, when they did his ancestry, this guy thought he was full-blooded native. And he found out that he's Irish on his father's side because he didn't know who his father was. Then when they tracked other names that came, it was the same last name as the priest that was the principal of the school. So clearly, that priest, that Irish priest, was his was his father. Another story they tracked, which is really kind of the main gist of some of this stuff, was a guy who was born in the residential schools. Well, wait a minute. How could a child be born in a residential school? They're not a birthing clinic. No, it's because his mother was raped by a priest. And what this school was doing was, and so this was a thing. This wasn't just a one-off. If a baby was born there, they'd throw the babies in the incinerator. So this guy was actually left by the incinerator to be burned when he was discovered. He was kind of like sitting there with trash. So he grew up his whole life being called the trash kid, the trash can kid. This guy was born in a residential school and left to be incinerated. He survived the incineration that was happening at these schools. And look, this wasn't the only school that did this kind of thing. We've heard stories of abortions, of babies who were just thrown in a hole and buried. And Native kids had to dig the holes. They had to dig the graves for these kids, not just babies, but their classmates. I hate to even use standard wording like that. But that's what took place in these schools. And it didn't matter if it was California, it didn't matter if it was Alaska, it didn't matter if it was Pennsylvania, Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Not far from Allentown, not far from, Philadelphia. So this, again, I get back to that, to the question. How could all of these schools be this abusive? I mean, how could it possibly be? Unless the abuse was not just systemic by coincidence. Because I don't buy the coincidence thing. And certainly the whole bad apple thing is out the window. So Deb Haaland does her 2 or 3 year investigation, lowballs every freaking number, said, well, we determined that at least 970 children died in these schools. 970? Hell, that many died, almost that many died at Carlisle. And you had over 400 of these schools? One of them almost meets that number? And you give us an at least number? She also said, we know that at least 18,000 such and such children were forced into these schools. 18,000, 10,000 went to Carlisle in only 40 years. How do they even come up with these numbers? Well, they just fabricate them. And what they say is, well, these are the ones we can document. These are church records that should have been held on these things. You were a government program. You were funding these schools. You didn't know how many kids were in these freaking schools? Oh, by the way, some of the gravestones at Carlisle said unknown on them. How do you have a kid in school and not know their name? Well, I'll tell you one way is you took their names away. It's the first thing you did. And then you gave them biblical names, Sarah, John, Paul, Jacob, Mary. That's what you did. Now, some of these kids must not have gotten to the point where they had been given a name. So they just, rather than using their native name, which they had to know, I'm sure they knew them. We're not going to put that on a stone. Oh, hell no. So last week, Joe Biden declares or proclaims that Carlisle Indian School is going to be a monument. He's declaring it a monument to residential schools. Well, what the hell does that mean? Oh, a national monument. Let me be clear. So it's their nation. So it's their national monument to what? Honor the survivors, celebrate the success of what your schools is, and make no mistake about it. These schools were successful. We live today in a situation where our people are so screwed up. Everything from identity crisis to how governance works, the amount of land that we lost, the whole identity, problem that we have. I mean, these things were effective. the number of Christians that exist on our territories. Look, the other thing that these schools did is they turned our kids into thinking military. Our boys were taught to march and follow orders. The natural progression was to join the military. So we have the highest enlistment rate in military service. The Choctaw Nation a few years ago passed a tribal council resolution declaring that the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma was a Christian nation. Talk about separation of church and state? Separation of church and state? Yeah, I don't think so. We have, you go on to most native territory. I live on a territory here where I think there's 7 churches here. And there's other Seneca communities with more churches. Even Tonawanda, which is supposed to be so traditional, their churches are bigger than their longhouse. Onondaga churches. In fact, a few years ago, a couple of kids got busted, or young guys got busted burning some of them. Oh, by the way, in this film, they talked about after the Kamloops discovery, a number of churches being burned that were somehow associated with these schools. And look, I'm not sorry about that. That doesn't bother me at all. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not saying burn people in the churches, but as far as destroying those things, and now to turn Carlisle into a monument, look, what it should be is a Holocaust museum. That's what it should be. And you know what? It shouldn't be run by the Smithsonian. Shouldn't be run by the government. Let us run. Give us the place. We'll put it all on display. We'll show the films. We'll create more documentaries. In fact, we'll create an entire documentary based on the transfer of this thing into a Holocaust museum. And that's what it is. It is the American Holocaust has a whole bunch of different fingers to it. I talk about residential schools being a genocide, and there's no question about that. But the entire relationship between Native people and the United States and its predecessors has been built on genocide. Doctrine of Christian discovery. Christians lay their eyes on our land, and it's theirs. Why? Because we're not Christians. And even territories that were Christians, no, you still don't get to keep the land. Native people can't hold title to the land. That's what the Doctrine of Christian Discovery says. That gets codified in the law. In a 10-year period between 1823 and 1833, 3 legal doctrines come out of the U.S. Supreme Court. The Doctrine of Christian Discovery become codified in law. The Trust Doctrine, where we're regarded as wards of the state. And the Plenary Powers Doctrine, where this court fabricated an interpretation of the Constitution to say, well, the Founding Fathers intended Congress to have ultimate and exclusive authority over Native peoples. The Constitution doesn't say that. It doesn't even come close to saying that. But that's what the Chief Justice John Marshall Court did. We weren't citizens. And in fact, I would argue many of us still will not accept the imposition of citizenship, which only came 100 years ago. Through the vast majority of our period of interaction with the United States, we were not part of the United States. Even as they're calling us wards of the state, even as they're stealing our land, they're stealing it from another people. And they're not stealing it. They're saying, no, we're not stealing the land. We acknowledge their right to live there. Of course, they didn't, because they drove Native people off of our lands. So they didn't even honor their so-called right of occupancy. They treated us like animals, because animals can't hold title to land. Yeah, there's deer that live there. There's beaver that live there. Groundhogs, squirrels. But they don't own the land. We acknowledge they have a right to be there until we don't, and then we put out bounties on wolves and the like. Bear, cougars. So, when I think about what the United States policies were, look, it was everything from scalp bounties, literally paying somebody to kill Native people, sever the top of their heads off, and bring the head, the skull and scalp of a Native person and get paid for it. And that just didn't happen under British rule. That happened out west during the gold rush. The intentional spread of disease. It's not just Lord Jeffrey Amherst who suggested that spreading smallpox with the blankets was a good way to populate the the land, meaning kill native people, which is what he wrote. I mean, that was his plan. He basically, it's the first provable documented use of germ warfare and this was Lord Jeffrey Amherst. But that's not the only place where intentional spread of disease. As I said, disease was allowed to run rampant in residential schools, in communities. It was intentional. So it didn't matter if it was typhoid fever. It didn't matter if it was the Spanish flu. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if it was COVID. So we had smallpox and all of these diseases. And look, and anytime somebody suggests that we just didn't have the immunity, that suggests that we were somehow less physical. Our physical attributes were less. And let's not leave out the other intentional spread of disease, which was syphilis and gonorrhea. James Cook, famous map maker, navigator, cartographer, whatever you want to call him, when he wrote in his journal upon his discovery of Hawaii, a nation state all by itself already, essentially, he lamented his concerns about letting his crew go on land because he knew that they would spread the venereal disease that they were carrying with them, and that the population could be decimated by it. Why? How did he know that? Because he had already gone to many other places. He had already gone to other populations in the South Pacific and other places. He saw the ravages of syphilis and gonorrhea when it was introduced into these. Now, and I've heard stories that try to suggest that native people were the source of some of these diseases, and that when they raped our people and went back to Europe, that's how it spread across Europe. I mean, I love the twist on that one. So they say they picked up a disease from native people, took it back to Europe. Yeah, that one's a little bit hard to believe. But yeah, so we have death by disease. We have death that was caused by the removing of people. We're not just talking about one incident of the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee. Look, there were thousands and thousands of native people who were marched from their homelands to be relocated someplace else to clear the way for white folks. And it wasn't even just east of the Mississippi. The Navajo went through it. I mean, it's the amount of removal of people from their lands that would instantly cause poverty and distress. All the so-called Sioux Wars, they were all based on the Homestead Act. Lincoln signs this law signs this bill into law that allows white people to start taking native lands. The United States creates a whole process for it. And the native people never get paid. Or it would take decades sometimes for native. When the Cherokee were marched out to Oklahoma, they were supposed to get paid to get out there. They were supposed to have things provided for them. Nah, it didn't come. They had to sue for it. And I don't know if they ever got paid, but after thousands died on the way. We're coming up on Christmas. The day after Christmas in 1862, 38 Dakota were hung by the neck as a result of crimes that they were convicted of in a week. 400, I think over 300 Native people were convicted and sentenced to death. And then Lincoln said, well, we can't execute 300. Let's get that number down. So Lincoln trimmed the number down himself. He had no knowledge of what was going on there. He just looked at the list and said, well, this one name showed up a few more times than the others. So he got it down to 39. Ultimately 38 were hung by the neck the day after Christmas in 1862. A week before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. A week before that. And why were they killed? Because their lands were taken. They were executed for raiding. And look, they make it sound like they were raiding non-native or white settlers. Like these white settlers were all, Michael Landon and Little House on the Prairie, a man with his girls. No. These were people who were trying to steal native lands, had a government permission to do it, and they weren't there. I mean, this wasn't Little House on the Prairie. These are people who were developed affluence. Look, here's the thing, and I bring this up because I did I used to screen films in New York City, and one of the films that I screened was the Dakota 38. It was a documentary that was done, produced, that reenacted or essentially redid the ride that the Dakota were forced to be on in December to go to be executed. This forced ride. So they do this ride, and again, we're talking Minnesota in December. They do this ride, and it's it's quite a group of Native people who are doing it, and it's different age groups, young people, old people, and one of the young guys in the film is a guy by the name of Billy Ray Dumark, and he stood out to me because when they were doing this ride, there were certain white people that were very, very helpful. You know, got them a tire when one of the tires went on the trailer. I mean, helped stable their horses when the weather got bad. I mean, some of these wealthy white folks opened up their ranches and brought their horses in to stable them and feed them. They had big receptions for these guys, but not all the Native people were that enthusiastic about it. And the one white guy from Long Island, I might add, who was part of the production crew, he couldn't understand. He goes, I don't understand how Native people can't be more gracious and more grateful. These people are opening up their homes practically. They even got shirts that said thank you in your language. I mean, they did all these wonderful things for you, and these guys, some of these guys don't appreciate it. He couldn't understand. Well, here's the thing. How are these white people so affluent on the lands that were once native lands? So yes, if I'm doing this ride and these white people are being so generous with their resources, I'm thinking, yeah, you got those resources from my people. So yeah, there was a lot of tensions there. Billy Ray Dumark spoke out and he said, look, I have a real problem being around, I think he said Caucasians or whatever else. But Billy Ray Dumark, as they tracked him through this documentary, he was kind of coming around. He was really quiet and, to himself. But towards the end, he was a lot more lively, a lot more smiles, a lot more jokes. And he said he couldn't wait. He couldn't wait to do the ride again the next year. But when he was interviewed, he talked about how bad it was at home, how bad his life was at home, and how much this ride meant to him. Well, when you watch the film and the credits, you see in memory of Billy Ray Dumark. Doesn't say why or how he died, so I looked it up. He committed suicide. He didn't make the next ride. That's the conditions that our people live in. These are the conditions that our people live in today. Look, this isn't just about what happened 100 years ago. I mean, the last residential school closed in the 90s, 1990s. So we aren't talking about ancient history. Yes, they go back a long ways. And the abuse would grow throughout all of those years. The abuse may have been worse at the end of this thing, at the end of this cycle or strategy, than at the beginning. I suspect. At least it was becoming more pronounced and more people were aware of it. Like I said, I don't believe that there was a handbook on how to abuse children that was circulated amongst all these schools. But there had to, I'm sorry, it just has to be more than a coincidence. I mean, it can't be just because when you place children with no oversight under the guidance of churches or headmasters or whatever else, it should never be considered a natural thing for that abuse to occur. And for it to have occurred so frequently and to have occurred in every one of these schools that have been documented so far, to the point where there are dead children, infants thrown in an incinerator, abortions being done to women. Sterilization of women. Well, we'll fix that. We'll make sure that these young girls aren't going to get pregnant here, so they weren't going to get pregnant anywhere. And of course, sterilization was also a policy by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in general, not just at these residential schools. When you look at the overall American Holocaust, residential schools is just one example of it. But it's so definitive. I mean, it is so clear that this was genocide. But I don't want it for a second to diminish the fact that they were murdering our people on the plains. From the beginning of the United States, one of the early massacres were the colonists killing Christian native people. They were Lenape. In the Gnadenhutten massacre or something along those lines. Out near Pittsburgh. Between Pittsburgh, and the Ohio border. They locked them into their church. They clubbed the men to where they were either dead or unconscious, and they burnt them and that's what they did. Why? Because they suspected the colonists, the Americans, thought they may be aligning themselves with the British. So that's one of the first documented American massacres. Now, of course, there were plenty of massacres that took place before that. The first Thanksgiving was a celebration of the massacre of the Pequots by the Pilgrims. The massacres would go on. December is a terrible month. Well, even the end of November, the Sand Creek Massacre at the end of November, where the soldiers didn't just kill warriors; they killed women and children, old men. They cut off their scrotums and the breasts off the women to make pouches out of their flesh. I mean, the mutilation was so obscene that it became well documented. There were articles in the paper, the New York Tribune, newspaper articles. Even Kit Carson, famed Indian killer, who bragged about killing warriors, he said, but I would never kill a woman or a papoose, he said. He even said he wonders how these people could do this, calling themselves Christians. That's what he asked. He questioned that. Kit Carson. So I don't want the genocide that the residential schools represents, which is part of a larger genocide. I don't want it to diminish the horrors that Native people went through, because those horrors led to these, some of them paralleled. I mean, one of the things I always have to remind people is when we talk about the 5 policies of the United States: extermination, removal, assimilation, termination, which is just them deciding that we don't exist anymore. That's just a declaration. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then self-determination. Those 5 policies, they don't just start and stop. Extermination extermination was still happening in residential schools. We would argue that when you consider missing and murdered Indigenous women and children and the complicity that the police have, extermination is still happening. The fact that our life expectancy is so low, the fact that our infant mortality rate and maternal mortality rate at childbirth is higher than anybody else, yeah, we're still being exterminated. Removal, Akwesasne is in the process right now of a bunch of fraudulent leaders signing away thousands of acres of land. So we're still being removed. Assimilation, we still have policies that we are exposed to. Our kids being indoctrinated in schools. We don't have our own schools for the most part. And to the extent that we have these schools, or have schools at all, the federal government has more to do with what's happening in the states, have more to do with what's being taught in those schools than we do. Now, I know we have freedom schools, and we have some of these schools that exist on some of our territories. But for the most part, the vast majority of Native kids are being taught and indoctrinated in American public schools and Canadian public schools. And what they're being taught is a lie. Much of it is a lie. So assimilation, they do these things. First they cast us as wards of the state, wards of the federal government. And then they claim ownership over us, even though we're not citizens, remind you. Again, trust doctrine comes in 100 years before the Citizenship Act of 1924. So even though we're a distinct people, they're claiming that they are our trustees and that we are their wards. And under their under their care and protection, all of this abuse takes place. The murders, the massacres, the residential schools. While they're claiming to be our trustees, mind you, the theft of our lands. I mean, it's criminal on every single level. Not only what was done to our people, but this notion that they claim to be our trustees all the time. Today, the vast majority of lands on the U.S. and Canadian side are held in trust for us. Why? Because we are still being deemed wards of the state. And that the Canadian government and the federal government and the U.S. federal government consider themselves our trustees. We are not considered responsible enough or trustworthy enough or civilized enough to hold title to our own lands. Now, I know many Native people say, well, we have our own land. Well, yeah, you do because you occupy it. But unless you're willing to fight for it, the United States and Canada still claim to own the land, own the underlying title to the land. Only a few places. I live on one of them here in Cattaraugus. This land is not titled, is not held by the federal government for the Senecas. There are a few places but the vast majority are held in trust. This land claim settlement that a few of these frauds have signed in Akwesasne is going to create trust land in a place that it was never trust land. And of course, then they claim 1871, they declare that Native people no longer are independent sovereign nations. They just declare it. And who does it? Congress does, because Congress is already asserting that they have ultimate authority over our lives. There's no basis for it. But that's how these schools happen. That's how this abuse happens. It's how the theft, the murders, all of it happens. It's all government policy. And yeah, they bring in the churches. And we know what the churches are about. But it's not a coincidence that these things happen in every school. It is not a few bad apples. Yeah, I know when a priest was accused of bad behavior, he'd get sent to another school or someplace else. Same thing happened within the parishes of across the country. A priest abuses a little altar boy and he gets sent to another church. Never convicted of the crime. And to be clear, these are crimes, not sins as Joe Biden called them. Well, they can be sins too, I guess. We cannot accept the narrative that they're trying to feed us about what these schools were. We have to create the narrative. Let us take over Carlisle Indian School and turn it into a Holocaust museum. That's what I say. Let's tell the truth. Because it isn't coming out in Deb Haaland and Brian Newland's report, and of course she's gone anyway. And it sure as hell ain't going to come out during the Trump administration. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the Canadian side was a debacle. It remains so. They never committed to finding how many children have died at those schools. It's only individuals. This whole film is based on the Native people themselves doing the investigation, not the federal government, not the Canadian federal government. And on the U.S. side, there's no real investigation. Nobody is subpoenaing all of the church records. Or the headmaster's records. Much of this stuff is documented. Yeah, I know some of the information's probably been destroyed. But to do a couple of crying sessions with Native people, that's not going to get done. I'm beyond crying. I'm pissed. And so should you be. And I don't care if you're Native or non-Native. You should be not only angry that the United States and Canada would, and did these things. You all should be demanding justice. You all should be demanding justice. And justice is going to only come when we have some of our land restored, our sovereignty restored. Not no, we're not trust. We're not wards of the state. You're not our trustees. And the idea that you could somehow keep us in this perpetual state of ward custodian relationship is absurd. It's absurd. Our lands and our sovereignty restored. You can't give us the lives you took back. And don't even suggest that you want to create language programs. Now we'll create the language programs, but yeah, you're going to pay, and you're not going to pay what you spent to commit this crime. No, you're going to pay based on the damages, the lives lost, the lives harmed, intergenerational trauma. This isn't $23 billion. It's not even $100 billion. It's more than that. I'm not asking you to cut a check. More important is the restoration. Truth and restoration. Forget your reconciliation. You were never our friends. We're not trying to reconcile to a better time. This isn't about make America great again. No. This is about restore. The only way you could do that is if you left. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for putting up with some of this stuff. It is these are tough conversations, but they're conversations that need to take place. I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.